Well, time now to speak to the government, and I'm delighted to say that joining me now is the Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. Good morning, Minister. Thanks so much for joining us. Want to get to what you're announcing in your department in a moment, but first of all, the news that President Biden has authorised Ukraine to use American-made missiles into Russian territory. Can we expect a similar permission from the Prime Minister relating to UK-made weapons soon?
Good morning. We remain steadfast in our support to the Ukrainian people. Almost 1,000 days into this conflict, they've suffered unimaginable hardship and loss and have made extraordinary sacrifice. You'll appreciate that the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary will always keep under review what the Ukrainian people and their military require. And going into the G20, the Prime Minister has set out very clearly that the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky have our full backing. That's always been on a cross-party basis in Parliament, and that's the approach we've taken from government to continue that approach.
In terms of whether it's likely to come immediately or not, I mean, has this been discussed at Cabinet?
You'll appreciate I can't comment on those kinds of discussions, but as I say, the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary will always keep under review what the Ukrainian government ask of us by way of support. We have provided considerable military assistance to the Ukrainian people in their fight against that terrible Russian aggression that we have seen. And as we come up to that 1,000 days of the conflict, it's more stark than ever what the Ukrainian people have had to go through.
I guess the only added point is that the UK for some time, both under the previous Premiership and under your own Premiership, has been looking to grant this permission, and the hold-up, as we were led to believe, was the US. So with that hold-up removed, is it fair to expect that British permission will be forthcoming too?
As I say, I'm not seeking to be difficult here, but these are sensitive matters that are rightly kept under review by the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary. And going into the G20, what the Prime Minister has said is that we continue to back the Ukrainian people. That was the approach taken by the last government. It is the approach that we have continued to take. And I think it's right that we as a nation stand behind the Ukrainian people in their hour of need.
I guess even regardless of what happens on the British permission, I wonder whether this is a victory of British diplomacy. It's something that, the US election date is probably a factor here, but I wonder whether the UK election date is. Is this something that Keir Starmer and David Lammy has convinced President Biden to do where Rishi Sunak and his administration failed?
Without commenting on the specific case here, what I would say is that we have consistently pushed for more support for Ukraine. But, credit to the previous Conservative government, they did the same. They had our full backing when they did so.
Let's touch on China as well. The Prime Minister is saying today that he's seeking a serious and pragmatic relationship with China. What does that mean?
Well, China are a major player, both in terms of the economy, but also in the Security Council. So it's right that we have that engagement, but that we do so on a pragmatic basis where we go into it with our eyes wide open. That does mean there will be challenge, constructive challenge, and there will be areas of profound disagreement.
If the US wanted you to be tougher on China, would you listen to them?
You'll appreciate I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals as to what might or might not happen into the future.
We
need
a likely
to maintain
thing to emerge. I would imagine there'll be these sorts of things in the next couple of years.
We'll always have our clear starting position. And, for example, through our engagement with China, the Foreign Secretary has made clear our concerns around human rights abuses, for example. But we do have to have a process of engaging with other nations, China included, and going into the G20, that's what the Prime Minister has set out.
Let's get to your brief. Apologies for taking a little while to get here. There was a lot of big international news to touch on. What are you announcing today?
So what I'm setting out today is the biggest reform of children's social care in a generation. Far too many very vulnerable children are being failed by a system that just isn't working for them. We've seen ever-increasing spend on crisis-level intervention, but alongside that, some really terrible outcomes for amongst the most vulnerable children in our country. So what I'm setting out today is that, firstly, we will do more to make sure that children can remain within family support networks wherever possible, and we put more investment in the budget into that. But where it isn't possible and where children do require a children's social care placement, we will crack down on the excess profiteering that we've seen in recent years and the poor quality placements, the unregulated placements, and make sure that we're taking more action there. But we've got to change the system so that there is more put in place earlier to help families to avoid storing up these big problems for the future.
How will you make the difference, decide the difference between a normal profit in running a private business and profiteering?
So what we will do first of all is bring in a financial oversight mechanism so we've got better visibility about what's going on, because at the moment we just don't have that. But you have some private providers who are securing 20 to 30% profits. And this is off the backs of very vulnerable children who've been through often amongst the most traumatic experiences you can imagine, who've experienced real problems within their families that have got them to that point. And I just think it is completely unacceptable to see that level of profit. Now, if providers don't respond, if they don't bring down those costs, then we will act to cap their profits. And I serve notice on them today that we will not hesitate to take the necessary action to make sure that we are getting much, much better outcomes for children in our country. There has been a failure over many, many years. The costs have continued to spiral. But more importantly, outcomes for children are just not good enough.
Should it be provided by the state? Would that be the simplest solution to this?
Well, we are providing more backing for state provision, for councils to either provide it directly or to work with others to do that with a £90 million investment and with wider changes in regulation to make that easier. But we are where we are in terms of we have private providers within the system, so there is a balance to strike. But where it comes to excess profiteering around vulnerable children, we've got to draw a line under this, and we will be setting out further plans today in Parliament about how we will make that happen.
Just finally, Minister, I wanted to ask you about the assisted dying bill. In 2015, you voted against the bill as it was then. How are you thinking of voting this time around?
As you'll know, the government doesn't take a position on this. It remains neutral. It's for individual members of Parliament to decide what they believe to be best. This is a very sensitive issue. It's difficult for everyone. As you say, back in 2015, I voted against that legislation, and I haven't changed my mind.
If there were different provisions in the bill, is this something that you're kind of against ideologically on principle, or does the bill just not go further enough to offset some of your concerns?
I think all of us weigh up the very strongly held views on both sides, and often the very passionate and quite understandable reasons that people set out their position around changing the law. I continue to think about this deeply, but my position hasn't changed since 2015.
Minister, thanks so much for joining us. Very good to see you as always.
Thank you.